It's been almost 5 years since I wrote my last book, Human JavaScript, and I'm excited to share what I've learned since then in the second book that I'm calling Human Redux. After the first book, Philip Roberts and I released this framework called &JS, and we were pretty excited about it. Some big companies were starting to use it, and we were getting good adoption, but we kept running across these problems where we'd try to build something that just didn't quite fit into the patterns that we had been using thus far, and it was really frustrating. I mean, we could usually make it work, but still it felt like this monster of complexity was kind of crawling back into our application, and honestly, I felt defeated by that. You know, here I am supposedly having solved how to build simple applications, and yet we are still struggling with making these things work. Thankfully, Philip forced me to take a second look at React and these Flux-like patterns. And initially I was resistant, but the idea of being able to just describe what it should look like at any point in time, the way that React does, just made a lot of sense, and it simplified a lot of things for me. At first, I paired React with ampersand models because that's what I knew how to work with. And honestly, this worked pretty well. I even taught a front-end master's course on how to do this. But over time, I came to realize that a lot of the smarts that we had built into ampersand just weren't really needed with this new rendering approach. But at the same time, I didn't know what else to use. There was a lot of options out there, but none of them really clicked. Then one day in the fall of 2015, I stumbled across this little library called Redux. It was tiny, it was only 2 kilobytes. It was really more of like an idea than it was a library. And it had this really cool approach of determining what had changed in your state. And I was like, yes, this is it. But again, as it turns out, there's a big gap between building a small little demo application like a to-do list versus building a full-fledged real-life application like the progressive web app that I recently helped Starbucks develop. As it turns out, on one hand we have this small little state container that is Redux, and on the other we have React, which knows how to render stuff, but there's this chasm in between. Like, where do you actually write your application code, and what patterns do you use to really connect the two? And that's where I think a lot of people have struggled with React and Redux, myself included. But eventually I found these patterns that worked, patterns that let me build really complex things without writing complex code. And I did this by borrowing concepts from how a spreadsheet works. If you think about a spreadsheet, you can actually have this formula that creates, complex things over here, and then you can just reference its result without having to think about how the formula actually got its result. And in this way, you can kind of stack these little bricks of logic to create really complex things without actually feeling overwhelmed by what's going on. And it turns out we can do the exact same thing with Redux. Peace ensued. Honestly, I feel like I finally killed this monster of complexity. If someone comes at me with a crazy feature where we need to, combine 47 API calls, and if it happens to be the third Wednesday in May, then we'll make an API call that will rotate a satellite somewhere. Like, fine, let's do it. It's not that big a deal because we have a way now to encapsulate these little pieces of logic and then just stack them to build whatever. And that's the sort of peace and confidence that I want you to be able to have as well, which is why I wrote this book. I put a ton of effort into this. I really hope that the ideas in here are helpful to you and that you find it really useful. Thanks.